The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October. David was sitting in his office in downtown Atlanta, reviewing engineering blueprints for a new shopping center, when his aunt called with news that would change everything. His grandfather had passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 93. David had always been close to his grandfather, even though they didn't see each other as often as he would have liked. Work kept him busy, and the 3-hour drive to his grandfather's small town seemed to get longer every year. But whenever they did spend time together, the old man would tell stories about the early days, back when things were different and much harder. His grandfather had been born in 1930, growing up during the Great Depression when most black families in rural Georgia had nothing. By the time he was 16, he was working at the local textile mill, pulling 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. The pay was terrible, but it was steady work when steady work was hard to find. What made his grandfather different was his dream. While other men spent their paychecks on Friday nights, he saved every penny he could. He had his eye on something bigger than just getting by week to week. There was a piece of land outside town that had been for sale for years. 47 acres of rolling hills covered in pine trees and wild grass. Most people thought it was too far from everything to be worth anything, but his grandfather saw potential. He saw space. He saw freedom. Most importantly, he saw something that could belong to his family forever. It took him 8 years of saving. But in 1948, at the age of 18, he bought those 47 acres for $800. That might not sound like much today, but back then, it was more money than most people saw in 2 years. His grandfather had worked double shifts, picked up extra jobs, and lived on nothing but beans and cornbread to save that money. David remembered his grandfather showing him the original deed during one of their visits. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but the words were still clear. The land was legally his, bought and paid for, with all the proper paperwork filed at the county courthouse. After buying the land, his grandfather built a small cabin where he lived for the next 15 years. He married David's grandmother in 1952, and they raised their children there. David's father was born in that cabin in 1954, along with his 2 brothers and sister. The family eventually moved to town when David's father started school, but they never sold the land. His grandfather held onto it like it was the most precious thing in the world. And in many ways it was. For a black man in 1950s Georgia, owning land meant everything. It meant independence. It meant security. It meant having something to pass down to the next generation. David's father had different dreams, though. He wanted to go to college, become a teacher, and live in the city. When he graduated high school in 1972, he moved to Atlanta and never looked back. He visited the family land maybe twice a year, usually during holidays or summer vacations. David grew up hearing stories about the land, but it always seemed like something from another time. His childhood was spent in Atlanta suburbs, going to good schools and playing organized sports. The rural land his grandfather treasured felt like a relic from a different world. When David graduated from engineering school in 1998, his grandfather was proud, but worried. He kept talking about the importance of the land, about keeping it in the family, about not letting anyone take what they had worked so hard to build. At the time, David thought his grandfather was just being sentimental about the old days. After David's father died in a car accident in 2010, his grandfather became even more focused on the land. During every phone call and every visit, he would bring up the property taxes, the boundaries, the importance of keeping the paperwork up to date. David handled all of this for him, paying the annual taxes and making sure everything stayed current with the county records. The land taxes weren't much, maybe $300 a year, but his grandfather insisted they be paid on time every single year. He would call David in January to make sure the payment had been sent. He treated those tax payments like they were the most important bills in the world. David visited the land a few times over the years, usually when his grandfather wanted to show him the boundaries or point out changes in the landscape. It was beautiful in its own way, with tall pine trees and small clearings where wildflowers grew. There was still a dirt road that led back to where the old cabin used to stand, though the cabin itself had fallen down years ago. But David never saw the land the way his grandfather did. To David, it was just empty space in the middle of nowhere. There was no cell phone service, no cable internet, no restaurants or shopping centers nearby. The nearest grocery store was 20 miles away. It felt isolated and forgotten. His grandfather had different eyes, though. He saw the land as proof of what his family could accomplish. He saw it as security for future generations. He saw it as something that could never be taken away as long as the taxes were paid, and the paperwork was kept safe. Now, sitting in his office after that phone call, David realized his grandfather's biggest treasure had become his responsibility. According to the will, the 47 acres were now his. Along with the land came a metal box containing all the original documents, the deed, tax records going back decades, and a letter his grandfather had written specifically for David. The letter was simple and direct, written in his grandfather's careful handwriting. It reminded David that the land represented more than just trees and grass. It represented sacrifice, determination, and the hope that future generations would have something solid to build on. It asked David to take care of the land the way it had taken care of their family. David folded the letter and put it in his desk drawer. He had every intention of honoring his grandfather's wishes, even though he wasn't sure what that meant exactly. For now, he would keep paying the taxes and maintaining the legal ownership, just like he had been doing for years. What David didn't know was that other people had been watching that land too. People who thought it had been forgotten. People who believed they could take what didn't belong to them. People who were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. 3 months after his grandfather's funeral, David was back to his normal routine. Work was busy, his family was healthy, and life in Atlanta kept him occupied from morning until night. The inherited land sat quietly in the back of his mind, something he thought about occasionally but never urgently. What David didn't know was that 150 miles away, a meeting was taking place that would change everything. The meeting happened in a glass conference room at Prestige Development Company, one of the largest home builders in central Georgia. Around the table sat 5 men in expensive suits studying maps and financial projections. They had been looking for the perfect location to build their next luxury housing development, and they thought they had found it. Robert Chen, the company's head of acquisitions, pointed to an aerial photograph of 47 acres of undeveloped land. The property was perfect, rolling hills, mature trees, and close enough to the growing suburbs to attract wealthy buyers who wanted space and privacy. This land has been sitting empty for decades, Chen told the group. According to our research, the last known owner died years ago, and there's been no development activity. It looks like a classic case of abandoned property. The development team had done what they called a title search, but it wasn't the kind of thorough investigation that legitimate companies perform. Instead, they had looked at outdated county records and made assumptions based on the fact that the land appeared unused. They saw that property taxes were being paid by someone named David Williams in Atlanta, but they convinced themselves this was probably a distant relative or maybe even a clerical error. In their minds, if someone really owned valuable land like this, they would be developing it, or at least visiting regularly. What they didn't bother to do was contact David directly. They didn't send letters, make phone calls, or do any of the legal steps required before claiming someone else's property. Instead, they decided to move forward with what they privately called aggressive acquisition. The plan was simple but risky. They would start construction immediately, betting that the real owner either didn't exist or wouldn't fight back. If someone did show up claiming ownership, they would offer to buy the land at a low price, arguing that their improvements had increased its value. It was a strategy that had worked for them before in cases involving elderly property owners or families who didn't understand their legal rights. But this time, they had badly miscalculated. The first bulldozers rolled onto David's land on a Monday morning in February. The construction crew had been told they were developing legally acquired property for a high-end residential community called Prestigious Pines. Within 6 months, the land was completely transformed. The dirt road that David's grandfather had driven for decades was replaced by smooth asphalt streets with names like Heritage Drive and Legacy Lane. The clearing where the old family cabin once stood became the site of a $3 million clubhouse with a golf course attached. The development moved fast because Prestige Development had deep pockets and political connections. They pulled permits through friendly contacts at the county planning office, many of whom didn't ask too many questions about land ownership as long as the paperwork looked official. By the end of the first year, 20 homes were completed and sold. The buyers were mostly wealthy retirees and young professionals who paid premium prices for what they believed was an exclusive gated community. Each house sold for between $400,000 and $600,000. The marketing materials painted a picture of luxury and exclusivity. Prestigious Pines offers the perfect blend of natural beauty and modern convenience, now the brochures claimed. Own your piece of Georgia paradise in this carefully planned community where every detail has been designed for the discerning homeowner. The sales team didn't mention that the company had never actually purchased the land they were building on. The buyers assumed everything was legal and proper, just like any other residential development. By the second year, 60 homes were occupied, and the community was thriving. The Homeowners Association had been formed, with monthly dues of $300 per household to maintain the clubhouse, golf course, and common areas. Families were moving in, children were playing in the streets, and property values were climbing. The irony was that David's grandfather would have been amazed by what was happening to his land. The vision he had of the property's potential was finally being realized, just not by his family and not with their permission. During this time, David continued his normal life in Atlanta. He kept paying the property taxes on schedule, just like his grandfather had taught him. The tax bills still came to his address, and he still sent the payments to the county courthouse without thinking much about it. The county gladly accepted his money every year. Even though they knew a major development was happening on the same property, no one at the tax office thought to mention this to David, and no one from the development company thought to check why someone was still paying taxes on land they were using. As the third year began, Prestigious Pines was nearly complete. 120 homes were either finished or under construction. The community had its own security gate, professionally landscaped common areas, and a waiting list of potential buyers. The homeowners loved their new community. They organized block parties, formed sports leagues, and created social media groups to share neighborhood news. Many of them had invested their life savings into homes they believed would be their forever residences. The development company was preparing to break ground on Phase 2, which would add another 80 homes and a shopping center. They had already started marketing the expansion, promising buyers that Prestigious Pines would become one of the most desirable addresses in the region. Robert Chen and his team were congratulating themselves on their success. They had turned empty land into a $50 million community in less than 3 years. The profit margins were enormous because they had paid nothing for the land itself. But their celebration was about to come to a very sudden end. David still had no idea what was happening to his inheritance. He drove past the general area a few times when visiting friends in smaller towns, but the main highway didn't provide a view of the development. The new community was set back from the road, hidden behind the same trees that had always been there. The few times David thought about visiting the actual property, something came up. Work deadlines, family obligations, or simple procrastination kept him away. He figured the land would always be there when he was ready to deal with it. He was right about the land still being there. What he wasn't expecting was to find 120 families living on it. David's discovery happened purely by accident. On a Saturday morning in late September, when he had finally decided to visit his grandfather's land. His wife had been encouraging him to make the trip for months, saying it might bring him some peace to spend. Time in a place that had meant so much to his grandfather. The drive from Atlanta took him through familiar small towns and past landscapes he remembered from childhood visits. As he got closer to the property, David felt a mix of nostalgia and guilt. It had been almost 4 years since his grandfather's death, and this was his first real visit to the land that had been left in his care. He turned off the main highway onto the old county road that led to his property. This part of the route was exactly as he remembered it. Narrow asphalt with pine trees pressing close on both sides. But as he approached the area where the dirt road to his land should be, something was very wrong. Instead of the familiar dirt path disappearing into the woods, David found himself looking at an elaborate stone entrance with the words, "Prestigious Pines," carved into granite pillars. Wrought iron gates blocked the road and a small security booth sat beside them. David pulled his car over and sat staring at the entrance, trying to process what he was seeing. This had to be a mistake. He must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. But when he checked his GPS and looked at the landmarks around him, there was no doubt. This gated entrance was exactly where his family's dirt road used to be. A security guard in a crisp uniform approached his car. "Good morning, sir. Are you here to visit someone in prestigious Pines?" David's mind was racing. "I think there's been some kind of mistake," he said. "This is supposed to be my family's property. My grandfather owned this land." The security guard looked confused. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is a private residential community. It's been here for about 3 years now. Are you sure you have the right location?" David showed the guard his GPS, pointing to the exact coordinates his grandfather had given him years ago. He showed him copies of the property tax bills that had been coming to his address. The guard examined the documents but shook his head. "I don't know anything about that, sir. All I know is this community was built by Prestige Development Company. Maybe you should contact them directly. I can't let you in without permission from a resident." David drove away from the gates feeling like he was in some kind of nightmare. He pulled into a gas station a mile down the road and called his aunt, the same woman who had called him when his grandfather died. "Aunt Betty, something crazy is happening," he said. "I went to visit Grandpa's land and there's a whole neighborhood built on it. Houses, gates, the works." There was silence on the other end of the phone. "That can't be right, David. Your grandfather left you that land free and clear. The deed is in your name now." "I know, but I'm telling you, there are houses everywhere. Someone built an entire community on our property." His aunt was quiet for a moment. "David, you need to call a lawyer right now. This sounds like someone stole your land." David spent the rest of Saturday driving around the perimeter of what used to be his property. Through gaps in the trees, he could see houses, manicured lawns, and golf cart paths. He counted at least 50 homes just from what was visible from the road. Back home that evening, David spread all of his grandfather's documents across his kitchen table. The deed was clear and legal. The property taxes had been paid every single year. According to every piece of paperwork he was the rightful owner of 47 acres that were now covered with someone else's houses. First thing Monday morning, David called Thomas Mitchell, a real estate attorney who had been recommended by a friend. When David explained the situation, Mitchell was immediately interested. "This is either the biggest paperwork mistake I've ever heard of, or someone committed a very serious crime," Mitchell said. "Bring me all your documents and let's figure out what happened." The meeting with Mitchell confirmed David's worst fears and best hopes at the same time. After reviewing the deed, tax records, and other documents, Mitchell was certain that David was the legal owner of the land. "There's no question about your ownership," Mitchell explained. "The chain of title is perfect, going back to your grandfather's original purchase in 1948. You've been paying property taxes continuously, which proves active ownership. Whoever built on this land did so illegally." Mitchell ordered a current survey of the property and requested all recent building permits from the county. What they discovered was even more shocking than David had imagined. Not only had Prestige Development built on his land without permission, but they had filed false documents claiming ownership. They had submitted forged deeds and fabricated title searches to obtain building permits. The entire development was constructed through fraud. "This isn't just a civil matter," Mitchell told David. "This is criminal. They didn't just build on your land by mistake. They knew exactly what they were doing." The survey confirmed that all 120 homes in prestigious Pines, plus the clubhouse, golf course, and common areas, were built entirely on David's property. Not a single building was on land that Prestige Development actually owned. Mitchell also discovered something that made the situation even more incredible. Under Georgia property law, any improvements made to land without the owner's permission legally belonged to the landowner. That meant David now owned not just the land, but everything built on it. "Let me make sure I understand this," David said during one of their meetings. "They built all these houses on my land without asking, and now I own the houses too?" "That's exactly right," Mitchell confirmed. "Every house, every road, every building they constructed is now legally yours. They essentially built you a $50 million development for free." But Mitchell also warned David that the situation was complicated. There were now 120 families living in homes they had purchased in good faith. These people had done nothing wrong. They believed they were buying legitimate property from a legitimate developer. "The homeowners are victims too," Mitchell explained. "They paid good money for homes they thought were legally theirs. This is going to be a complex situation to resolve." David felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was facing. One day he owned empty land he rarely visited, and the next day he owned a massive residential development with hundreds of residents. Mitchell began preparing legal documents to assert David's ownership and demand that Prestige Development explain their actions. But before filing anything in court, he wanted to approach the company directly to see how they would respond. The initial letter was simple and direct. It informed Prestige Development that they had built their entire community on land owned by David Williams, and it demanded an immediate explanation of how this had happened. The response came 3 days later, in the form of a phone call from Robert Chen himself. "Mr. Williams," Chen said, "I think there's been some misunderstanding about the ownership of that property. We've done extensive research, and our legal team is confident in our position. I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone." David's attorney advised him to say very little during that first conversation. But privately, Mitchell was amazed by Chen's response. "He's not even denying that you own the land," Mitchell told David. "He's just hoping you'll take some kind of settlement and go away. He has no idea what kind of legal trouble he's in." David was about to find out just how much trouble Chen and his company were really facing. The second meeting with Robert Chen took place in a downtown law office, with attorneys present on both sides. David could tell immediately that Chen's confidence had evaporated since their phone conversation 3 days earlier. Chen's legal team had clearly done their homework since receiving Mitchell's letter. The corporate lawyer sitting next to Chen looked like he would rather be anywhere else in the world. "Mr. Williams," Chen began, "we may have made some errors in our initial property research. We're prepared to offer you fair compensation for any inconvenience this situation may have caused." Mitchell leaned forward. "What kind of compensation are we talking about?" "We're thinking somewhere in the range of $200,000. Plus we'll handle all the legal paperwork to transfer ownership of the land to our company officially." David almost laughed out loud. $200,000 for land that now had $50 million worth of development on it? Either Chen was completely delusional, or he was hoping David didn't understand what he actually owned. Mitchell's response was calm but devastating. "Mr. Chen, I don't think you understand the legal situation you're in. My client doesn't need to sell you anything, because he already owns everything. Every house, every building, every improvement you've made belongs to him under Georgia property law." The color drained from Chen's face. "That's impossible. Those homes belong to the people who bought them. We have bills of sale, mortgages, deeds." "Bills of sale for property you never owned," Mitchell replied. "Those deeds you issued are worthless because you had no legal right to sell the land in the first place. Under state law, all improvements made to property without the owner's consent become the property of the legal owner." Chen's attorney finally spoke up. "We'll need to research this issue more thoroughly. This meeting is over." As they left the office, Mitchell explained to David just how deep the legal hole was for Prestige Development. "They're not just facing a civil lawsuit," he said. "They could be charged with fraud, theft, forgery, and racketeering. This is the kind of case that sends people to prison." Over the next 2 weeks, Mitchell's investigation revealed the full scope of what Prestige Development had done. They had forged documents, bribed local officials, and deliberately ignored property records that clearly showed David's ownership. The scheme went all the way to the top of the company. Internal emails, which Mitchell obtained through legal discovery, showed that Chen and his partners knew they were building on someone else's land. In one email, Chen had written, "Even if the real owner shows up, we'll have so much invested that we can force a settlement for pennies on the dollar." That email became the centerpiece of Mitchell's strategy. It proved that Prestige Development had committed intentional fraud, not just made an honest mistake. But the legal case was only part of David's problem. He now owned 120 homes where families were living their daily lives. Children were going to school. Adults were working from home offices, and elderly couples were enjoying retirement in houses they believed they owned. The residents of prestigious Pines had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. They continued paying their mortgages, maintaining their lawns, and participating in community events. Their homeowners association kept collecting monthly dues and planning social activities. David visited the community several times over the following weeks, always accompanied by Mitchell. The security guard had been instructed to let them in after Mitchell showed legal documents proving David's ownership. Walking through the neighborhood was surreal. The houses were beautiful, the landscaping was immaculate, and everywhere David looked, he saw evidence of families who had built their lives around homes they thought were permanently theirs. He met some of the residents during these visits. There was an elderly couple who had moved from Florida to be closer to their grandchildren, a young family who had bought their first home after saving for years, a retired teacher who had invested her entire pension in what she hoped would be her final residence. These conversations made David realize that winning his legal case was only the beginning of his challenges. Even if he legally owned everything, he couldn't just kick families out of their homes. The moral complexity of the situation was overwhelming. Mitchell advised David that he had several options, none of them simple. He could demand that Prestige Development buy the entire property from him at current market value, approximately $50 million. He could allow the current residents to purchase their lots and homes directly from him, or he could pursue criminal charges and let the courts sort everything out. The situation became more complicated when news of the legal dispute reached the residents. Someone leaked information about David's ownership claim, and panic spread through the community overnight. Property values immediately began dropping as potential buyers learned about the ownership dispute. Current residents found themselves trapped in homes they couldn't sell and might not actually own. The Homeowners Association called emergency meetings to discuss legal action against both David and Prestige Development. David received dozens of phone calls from distraught residents. Some were angry, threatening to sue him for disrupting their lives. Others were sympathetic, understanding that he was as much a victim as they were. A few offered to buy their properties directly from him if he could prove legal ownership. The media attention was intense. Local newspapers ran headlines about the land grab scandal and the $50 million mistake. Television reporters interviewed residents, legal experts, and anyone else connected to the story. David found himself at the center of a controversy he had never wanted. He was portrayed alternatively as a victim seeking justice and as a greedy opportunist trying to steal people's homes. The truth was more complicated than either narrative suggested. Meanwhile, Prestige Development was falling apart. The company's other projects were being investigated by state authorities. Investors were pulling out, and construction crews were walking off job sites. Chen and his partners were hiring criminal defense attorneys and pointing fingers at each other. The Homeowners Association hired their own legal team to explore their options. Their attorney explained that while they were innocent victims, their legal position was weak. They had purchased homes from a company that had no right to sell them. "This is like buying a stolen car," the association's lawyer explained to a packed community center. "Even if you paid fair market value and didn't know it was stolen, you don't get to keep the car when the real owner shows up." The room erupted in angry voices and tearful questions. People demanded to know how they could protect their investments and their families' futures. David watched news coverage of that community meeting from his home in Atlanta. Seeing the fear and anger on residents' faces made him realize that his legal victory would be meaningless if it destroyed the lives of innocent people. He called Mitchell that night with a decision. "I want to find a solution that works for everyone," David said. "I don't want to be the guy who kicks families out of their homes." Mitchell warned him that being generous might cost him millions of dollars. "You have them over a barrel legally," he said. "You don't have to give them anything." "My grandfather didn't buy that land to hurt people," David replied. "He bought it to build something good for his family. Maybe we can still do that." The phone call that would change everything came the next morning. It was from Chen, and his voice was shaking. "Mr. Williams, we need to talk. I think we can work out a deal that makes everyone happy." David was about to discover just how desperate Chen really was. The final negotiation took place in a neutral conference room downtown, with more lawyers present than David had ever seen in one place. On one side sat David and his attorney Mitchell. Across the table were Robert Chen, his criminal defense lawyer, a representative from Prestige Development's insurance company, and two attorneys from the Homeowners Association. Chen looked like he had aged 10 years in the past month. The confident developer who had once dismissed David's ownership claim was gone, replaced by a man facing potential bankruptcy and prison time. "Let me lay out the facts," Mitchell began. "Mr. Williams owns the land. He owns all the improvements built on it, and he has the legal right to evict everyone and demolish everything if he chooses. The question is whether we can find a solution that doesn't destroy innocent people's lives." The insurance company representative spoke first. "Our investigation confirms that Prestige Development acted fraudulently. We're prepared to pay out the maximum policy limits of $20 million to resolve all claims. David had already discussed this with Mitchell. $20 million was substantial money, but it was less than half the actual value of what had been built on his land. The Homeowners Association attorney made an emotional appeal. My clients are ordinary families who saved their entire lives to buy these homes. They did nothing wrong. Many of them are elderly or have children in local schools. Displacing them would be devastating. David had been thinking about these families for weeks. He had driven through the neighborhood multiple times, watching children playing in yards and elderly couples tending their gardens. These weren't rich investors or speculators. They were working families who had found their piece of the American dream. But David also thought about his grandfather, who had worked double shifts for 8 years to buy this land. The old man had sacrificed everything to give his family something permanent, something that could never be taken away. I want to honor my grandfather's memory, David said finally. He bought this land so his family would always have something solid to build on. Maybe we can make this work for everyone. The solution David proposed surprised everyone in the room. Instead of demanding maximum compensation or forcing mass evictions, he offered a path forward that acknowledged both his legal rights and the residents' legitimate interests. First, Prestige Development would pay David $30 million. The $20 million from insurance plus $10 million from the company's remaining assets. This represented fair compensation for the unauthorized use of his land and the profits they had made from selling homes they didn't own. Second, current residents would have the option to purchase their lots directly from David at below-market prices. Those who had already paid off their mortgages could buy their quarter-acre lots for $50,000 each. Those still making mortgage payments could add the lot purchase to their existing loans. Third, David would donate $5 million from his settlement to establish the Thomas Williams Educational Foundation, named after his grandfather. The foundation would provide scholarships for students from working families to attend college and trade schools. The proposal wasn't perfect for anyone, but it was fair to everyone. Residents would keep their homes at affordable prices. David would receive substantial compensation, and his grandfather's legacy would live on through helping other families build better futures. Chen's criminal problems weren't resolved by the civil settlement. State prosecutors had been building a case against him and his partners for fraud, bribery, and racketeering. The evidence was overwhelming, including the email where Chen had acknowledged building on someone else's land. 6 months later, Chen pleaded guilty to multiple felonies and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. His partners received similar sentences. Prestige Development declared bankruptcy, and its remaining assets were liquidated to pay victims and creditors. The resolution of the civil case took almost a year to complete. During that time, David became a frequent visitor to what the residents still called prestigious Pines. He got to know many of the families personally and was often invited to community events. The elderly couple from Florida became particularly close to David. They had been terrified of losing their retirement home, and David's generous settlement terms allowed them to stay. They reminded him of his own grandparents, and he enjoyed their stories about raising children and building careers. The young family with the first home used the Educational Foundation to help their oldest daughter attend community college. She was studying to become a nurse, and the scholarship covered her tuition and books. The retired teacher organized a community garden in one of the common areas, donating fresh vegetables to local food banks. She told David that his grandfather would have been proud to see the land being used to help others. Not everyone was happy with the outcome. Some residents felt they shouldn't have had to pay anything additional for land they thought they already owned. A few lawsuits were filed, but they were eventually dismissed when courts confirmed David's ownership rights. Some legal experts criticized David for being too generous. They argued that he could have demanded full market value for everything and left the homeowners to fight Prestige Development for compensation. But David felt good about his decision. The land his grandfather had sacrificed to buy was now home to more than 300 people. It was being used to educate young people through the Scholarship Foundation, and David had received enough money to secure his own family's future while honoring his grandfather's memory. The media coverage of the final settlement was extensive. David was portrayed as an example of how legal disputes could be resolved with both justice and compassion. Several law schools began using the case as an example of creative problem solving in complex property disputes. David used part of his settlement money to build a small house on a corner of the original property that hadn't been developed. It wasn't far from where his grandfather's cabin had stood decades earlier. He and his family visited regularly, and his children loved exploring the same woods where their great-grandfather had once walked. The house included a small office where David kept his grandfather's original documents and photos of the land through different eras. Visitors could see the progression from empty wilderness to family homestead to thriving community. 5 years after the settlement, David was elected to the prestigious Pines Homeowners Association board. The community had grown and prospered, with property values recovering completely. The uncertainty about ownership was behind them, and residents took pride in their unique story. The Thomas Williams Educational Foundation had grown beyond David's original expectations. Corporate donations and community fundraising events had increased the endowment significantly. The foundation was now providing scholarships to dozens of students each year. David often spoke to local groups about property rights, the importance of proper documentation, and how his grandfather's careful record-keeping had ultimately protected the family's interests. He emphasized that owning land was about more than just holding a deed. It was about understanding responsibility to both past and future generations. The case became a landmark example of how property law actually works in practice. Legal experts pointed out that David's situation, while dramatic, demonstrated principles that apply to any property owner. Keep good records, pay taxes on time, and never assume that unused land is abandoned land. For David, the most meaningful part of the entire experience was discovering what his grandfather had really left him. It wasn't just 47 acres of trees and grass. It was a lesson about the value of perseverance, the importance of following the law, and the power of treating others with fairness and respect. Every time David visited his house on the land, he thought about his grandfather's vision of something permanent that could be passed down through generations. That vision had come true in ways the old man never could have imagined, but the fundamental principle remained the same. Sometimes the best inheritance isn't money or property. Sometimes it's the example of how to live with dignity. Work hard for what you believe in, and always do the right thing even when it costs you something. David's grandfather had given him all of that, along with 47 acres that became home to hundreds of people and a foundation that would help thousands more. It was a legacy that would last for generations.